All right, that's enough of that. Oh, God, I gotta get this off. It is way, way, way too hot for this. Ah, okay, that's better. You know, I really, really wanted to title this video, I'm Done Pretending The Shining is Good, except that for as long as I've had a platform, I've never pretended it's good. So, there goes that idea. The Shining, possibly the best remembered film by the legendary director Stanley Kubrick, with pretty much a permanent spot at any top 5 best horror movies of all time list that any mainstream outlet puts out. It's usually duking it out with The Exorcist for the top spot, if we're being honest, and it's also a movie that I don't like. I could be more hyperbolic about that, but let's start there for now. I don't like it. I don't think it's very good. And were it not the favorite horror movie of seemingly every former film student and critic between the ages of 30 and 60, maybe I could have left it at that. But, okay, you ever find that you didn't like a thing only to realize literally everybody else thinks it's the best thing ever, and it just makes you go from dislike to hate out of confused spite? That's me in this movie. Because for decades, I've been listening to glowing praise from every corner of the film world and seen 7,500 word essays on the opening credits alone. That's not a joke. I've frickin' seen it. And I've listened to film nerds fail to hide their boners as they talk about the deep meaning of a goddamn rug pattern. And after being bombarded with all that, I absolutely hate this movie. While I've been pretty casual with pointing out that I think this movie is not only overrated, but also plainly not very good, because it's worth remembering that something can be overrated and still be good, I have resisted going into depth on it because I knew that if I was going to actually make my case for why I don't like this movie, I couldn't go off of years-old memories of the last time I watched it. Because defenders of this movie are so meticulous that one single wrong statement or misremembered detail, and they will be all over me. So that would mean, to get into all my issues with it, I would have to watch it again. And I've said flat out, I'm not doing that unless somebody pays me. Yeah, well, somebody did. Somebody commissioned me to do a review of The Shining, and unlike most commissioned reviews, I'm not just going to rant this one out and dump it into the break room. Check out my secondary channel, Break Room of Geeks, where most of my reviews go. Subscribe now. Supplies are limited. No, I'm going to do this properly. But before I do, I want to clear up one thing, and then I want to lay out some ground rules. The thing to clear up is this. Whenever I tell people that I don't like this movie, the immediate response that I get is, oh, you're a fan of the book then. No, I'm not. I've never read it. I've actually never finished any of Stephen King's work. I'm honestly not sure what it is. Something about his writing style doesn't grab me. I mean, it can't be the core ideas he comes up with because I've liked enough movies that are based on his work. But I don't know. It just doesn't gel. So no. I'm not a fan of the book. I don't hate this thing because of the very significant changes that even ticked off King himself. Nope, I hate this movie purely on its own merits. None of my issues with the film are adaptational changes in the strictest sense. So almost none of that is going to be a part of this. You can pop on over to Dominic Noble's channel for that kind of analysis. He did The Shining almost a decade ago. The closest that I'm going to come to that kind of criticism is going to be when I take issue with things that I don't actually think enhance the story, where I know the reason why they're here when maybe they should be cut is because they're from the book. But I will get into all of that later on. So with that cleared up, about those ground rules, I'm going to make a deal with you. Yes, you. The self-styled film analysts in the comments who are ready with their stories of the meticulous work and the deep meaning behind literally every shot of the movie. Here's the deal. Past this introductory section, I'm not going to bring up what an abusive asshole Kubrick was. I won't talk about his relentless emotional abuse of Shelley Duvall. I won't talk about how he would do 100 takes because of his misguided perfectionism, or how that at a certain point that kind of behavior is no longer about getting the right shot and it's just about one guy's ego, as he wastes the time of literally everyone else on set with reported 16-hour shooting days for a year. Over a year. From here on, I'm not going to bring up any of that in my criticism, and will instead be discussing the merits of the film as a film. I will leave the production nightmare out of it. I will not use the production of the movie to attack it. And in return, you won't use the production to defend it. And by that, I mean you won't defend the film with full essays on the meaning of rug patterns, or the placement of a picture on the wall, or the important Steadicam work and how groundbreaking that was, or anything that someone can't know just from watching the film. If your defenses require deep knowledge of the production or decades worth of critical analysis or conspiracy-laden readings of the film, I don't want to see it. Defend the movie as a movie, not as a semester's worth of film school homework. That's the deal. I won't point out Kubrick was an asshole. You won't defend the movie with stuff that can't be gleaned from just watching the damn thing. Deal? Boy, I hope so. All right. Let's do this. While I'm going to structure this loosely around the narrative, I'm not going to give a complete plot summary. I'm just going to go ahead and take advantage of the fact that you all know how The Shining goes. Even if you've never seen the dang thing, you know from cultural osmosis and parodies and memes alone.
Go crazy?
Don't mind if I do!
Now, I am still going to start out going chronologically just because it helps me pace out what works and what doesn't. Because, yes, some of this is in fact genuinely great. And I'll give praise when it comes up. But let's be upfront about this. The opening shots, they're just gorgeous. They're stunning. It's amazingly smooth aerial photography, decades ahead of the invention of drones, and right off the bat gives a sense of isolation through the long, winding roads and the fact that if Jack's car isn't the only one on the road in any given shot, all the other cars are either pulled to the side or going the other way. No one is going where this car is going. The music is... Okay, so in this bit, the music is doing its job. I think it gets better when it gets more discordant in the back half. But I'm also going to talk more about the music in specific later, so let's stick a pin in that for now. Overall, this is a really good opening for a horror movie that will heavily feature both geographic and personal isolation and the impacts they have on people. And then the credits start scrolling up. These flat, basic, made-for-TV ass looking credits. Why? Why in the hell do the credits look like that? I'm about to use a phrase that gets abused a lot in online criticism, and I almost never use this, but these are objectively bad. They don't fit the mood. They're distracting in their banality. I've tried my damnedest to see if anybody had an explanation to offer for these. I've actually gone through that aforementioned 7,500 word essay on just the opening of this film, and the closest there is to a justification for these titles is bringing up the color and what the meaning of a negative inversion of that color would mean. And that's exactly the kind of nonsense I do not want to see in the comments. But seriously, even that essay doesn't really try to justify the slow scroll of credits one after another. These credits suck, and they're actually made worse for running over such gorgeous and effective footage. So hey, you know what else ruins a good presentation? Having to use still images instead of actual footage. Hey there! So you probably noticed that I started using some stills after initially starting using footage. You're going to get a mix for the remainder of this video, but a lot of it, possibly even the majority at this point, is going to be stills. And that is not what I want, but it's what I have to do in order to get YouTube off my back about the copyright issues. Despite the fact that this is fair use, they claim it anyway, and there's only so much fighting I'm willing to do. At this point, as YouTube continues to get worse, I am putting my preferred cuts with footage and minimal, if any, use of stills up on my Patreon. So if you want to see the proper version of these videos and also get to see them a week in advance, usually, assuming something hasn't thrown my schedule off. I've been good about it lately. Head on over to my Patreon. You can support me at any tier there, and you get to see things 1 week in advance. And there's other benefits as well. Names in the credits, Patreon exclusive Discord, etc., etc. Yeah, I'm sticking the plug in here. I think I've earned it. I had to go through 7 edits of this thing before I came up with a version that YouTube was willing to accept. Okay, I'm done. Back to it. Once the credits are done, we get a title card for the interview. Now, I'm a little mixed on the title cards. I think the ones later on in the film denoting the passage of time are decently effective, but these first few, I don't really think they help. Other than, I suppose, establishing that title cards are going to be a thing in this. But as for the interview itself, holy crap, is this a clunky exposition dump. Getting to that point works well enough. We lead in with a nice long tracking shot establishing some of the hotel geography and also showing the hotel with people in it, which will contrast nicely with the emptiness later on. Jack meets Mr. Ullman. It's a little stuffy, informal, but you know, it's a job interview, so that works. We fade to Jack's wife, Wendy, and their son Danny so that the full primary cast can now be considered established. Also established is Danny's imaginary friend Tony, who does not want to go to the hotel. Now, Danny doesn't really talk all that much like an actual kid, but given some of the stuff going on with him, I don't actually consider that to be that much of a problem. Like, this scene's fine. But it fades back to the interview, and it's time for that atrocious exposition dump. And I really mean it. This is like visual storytelling 101, how to make exposition awkward and boring. Bill shows up, and why? Who the hell is Bill? He just sits there and literally contributes nothing to this, or indeed any of the other scenes he shows up in. But the real problem here is Mr. Ullman's slow explanation of the vital information the audience needs. As if the audience can't just pick up mid-conversation and get some context and we can skip ahead a little bit. This scene goes on for nearly 5.5 minutes. No music, all static shots. They couldn't even be bothered to make it a walk and talk of some kind. I am truly hard pressed to think of a clunkier way to do this. Ullman might as well be directly addressing the camera and going, "Now, audience, these are the things you need to know ahead of the story we're about to tell." A freaking text crawl at the start of the movie would have been more subtle than this. And to make the point that I'm not just hammering on this for the sake of it or for want of bitching, the scene between Wendy and the doctor after Danny passes out is also an exposition dump. But it's nowhere near as painful as this. If you start counting from when Danny's being examined by the doctor and then count that whole conversation, it's almost as long as the interview. But it works because it's actually doing something other than just giving history and background. The way in which Wendy talks about Danny and Jack tells us things about her. Her slight nervousness and the sense that she's covering for Jack and making excuses for things that probably shouldn't be glossed over are things that will be built on as the story progresses. The interview, on the other hand, tells us nothing meaningful about Jack because he's not revealing anything about himself as a character. This isn't Jack. This is the face Jack puts on to get a job. And it's a side of the character we're basically never going to see again and would have no reason to think is in any way authentic. But even that potential inauthenticity doesn't really tell us anything either besides the man wants the job. Whereas Wendy's scene gives us insight into who she is by telling us in her own words what's gone on in her life up to that point and the excuses and the allowances she's already been making when it comes to Jack. So she mentions that Danny's injury, the one where Jack yanked his arm hard enough to dislocate Danny's shoulder, she mentions that happened when Danny was starting nursery school. Now, that's basically another term for preschool, so Danny would have been anywhere from 3 to 5. But importantly, no matter what, it was years younger than he currently is. It has to have been. And Wendy goes on to say that Jack's been sober for 5 months.
He hasn't had any alcohol in 5 months.
5 months of sobriety, and she tries to claim that is the good thing that came out of Danny's injury, despite years separating the two things.
Something good did come out of it all because he said, Wendy, I'm never going to touch another drop.
This isn't a mistake. She's making excuses. She's finding a way to frame Jack's abuse as both over and in a roundabout way a net positive. This will be confirmed later when Jack complains about how she's holding something against him from
3 goddamn years ago.
But if you're paying attention to just this scene on its own, and by paying attention, I mean just taking in all the spoken information, not projecting meaning and theory onto it, you will catch that something's already off and Wendy isn't properly confronting it. She's excusing it. That is important for her character. That's why this scene of exposition works and Jack's doesn't. Actually, backing up a second to Danny having his conversation with Tony and seeing the elevator of blood amongst other things before passing out. So, about that elevator. That's an amazing shot. It's iconic for good reason. It is also overused across the film. We're going to see it 2 more times in flashes before it gets seen by Wendy near the end. And by the time that happens, it's just the thing we've already seen 3 times, except now it's not just Danny having a vision. And I'm sure somebody's going to tell me it's symbolic of something, like, I don't know, I guess it happens at certain escalating points with Jack. Like we get a flash where Jack snaps at Wendy after she suggests that Danny should be taken out of the hotel. And again, when she finds Jack's manuscript before she sees it for real. But like, we can see that these are points of escalation just from how Jack is behaving. What are these flashes adding? And again, it's a fantastic shot, but it's milked to absolute death. And I think that if you're going to tease a scene 3 times before it happens, that the last time would somehow be different. Additional elements we didn't know about before. A surprise outcome past the point we've seen up to that point. You know, anything, but no. It's just the same old blood-filled elevator. And let's just remind ourselves before too many of you start scoffing at me going, she doesn't even know the significance of the blood evader. I'm not here to make you think the movie is bad. I am here to explain to you why I personally think it's bad. You do not need to share my views. I'm just explaining them. So, family drives up to the hotel as it's closing down for the season. We get a little glimpses of the fact that Jack already seems kind of irritated by them, Danny in particular. When Danny says he's hungry, Jack gives a mild chastisement, and it's only Wendy who actually proposes a solution. So let's make something clear at this point. Jack is never depicted as a loving husband or father. This itself is not a problem on its own. He doesn't have to be good at either of those things. He's going to be the primary threat eventually after all. But it becomes a problem because I'm of the opinion that the movie isn't very good at deciding how much of what's going on with Jack is due to the hotel and how much of it is just the kind of man he already was. And I know that some people praise the movie on that basis and even argue that the film is ambiguous about whether the ghosts are real. It isn't ambiguous at all about that, but more on that later. But I really don't think the film does a good job of finding or showing where the distinction is between Jack, the flawed man, and Jack, the ghost-encouraged killer. And while it's possible for the movie to be presented in a way where that distinction might not matter, I don't think that this manages that. I'll get more into this down the line, so just keep it in mind as we go. We get a walk and talk between Ullman, Jack, and Wendy, which gives us some more long tracking shots, lay out more of the geography, as well as light exposition, which goes down better than the interview just for the fact that it's not a static scene. This is where we get mentions of Indian burial grounds and also acknowledgement of some native designs on some of the interior. And I know that this is a heavy feature in theory crafting around this movie, as well as the burial grounds thing just being on vogue at the time in horror stories. It was very much
The style at the time.
I'm mostly going to move past it though, because the hauntings don't really integrate the idea of native culture or revenge in any meaningful way. And honestly, unless you're a theory crafter, this is just background horror flavor. So then we get the introduction of the most significant character besides the Torrance family, Dick Halloran, played by Scatman Crothers. Dick's the head chef at the hotel, so appropriately enough, he shows Wendy, along with Danny, around the kitchen. And while doing so, without breaking his conversation with Wendy, he reaches out telepathically to Danny.
How'd you like some ice cream, Doc?
He soon gets the chance to talk to Danny one-on-one by offering him ice cream as Jack and Wendy are given the rest of the tour. And this is where we find out about the titular shining. It's a little vague, but it mostly comes down to a select few people having things like a limited amount of telepathy, clairvoyance, definitely some spiritual sensitivity. Dick has it, Danny has it, and it doesn't matter to the plot at all. Yeah, okay. So, like, this is actually kind of a huge problem. And it's one that I at least think I know how it happened, although knowing how it happened doesn't fix it. So, with Kubrick shifting much more the focus on Jack and overall de emphasizing the supernatural elements compared to how big they were in the book, the actual narrative use and purpose of The Shining is reduced down to practically nothing. But Kubrick also couldn't just cut it because it's the title of the book. I mean, I suppose he could have changed the title. That's what happened with some Stephen King stories, like The Body becoming the movie Stand By Me. But, like, in that case, it was a short story as opposed to a bestseller. The Shining was a hit book. Its existing cultural impact was part of the reason it was getting made. That title had value. So, no, he probably couldn't change that title. And as a result, you can't cut The Shining from the story completely. Otherwise, the title doesn't make sense, even though it probably shouldn't be there. Okay, well, all right. Hold on. Let me back up and explain why it doesn't matter in the story as presented. Let me back up that statement. What actually happens as a result of The Shining? Danny has a few visions before they get to the hotel. Okay, but he doesn't act on them or tell anybody about them. Do they enable him to see the ghosts? Maybe. But both Jack and later on Wendy are going to start seeing things too. So at most, The Shining gives Danny a brief lead on seeing things. But again, he doesn't take any action as a result of that. He hears his parents arguing across the hotel when they're well out of earshot. Okay, but again, he doesn't do anything with that information. Dick hints that the hotel itself can shine. Okay, that's just a haunting though. Nothing that the hotel does really exceeds what one would expect from a run-of-the-mill haunting. Oh, Halloran sets up room 237, and that ties into the haunting. It's just an extra cursed room. You don't need The Shining for that. The Shining ties into Tony. I mean, I guess, but does that matter? All Tony does is give Danny some glimpses. I've already said how those don't do anything, and later on when Tony appears to talk through Danny...
Danny's not here, Mrs. Torrance.
How is that functionally any difference from just a trauma response? The only aspect of The Shining that does anything at all is that it connects Dick and Danny so that Dick can sense something is wrong and heads back to the hotel, which does need to happen because otherwise Wendy and Danny don't have a means of leaving across the snow. But the problem with that is you don't need The Shining to do that. The exact same end could have been accomplished by conventional means. Like, we're going to see from Wendy's later conversation with the Forest Service that she's lonely, needing some level of interaction. So, what if, I don't know, before the phones go down, Dick calls to see how things are and she gets a little too comfortable in the conversation. She lets something slip, makes him not massively worried, but a little concerned. Like something like what happened with the doctor before, but Dick catches it where the doctor didn't. It's enough to start the concern, and then the rest basically just plays out as it already does. The phones go down, Dick tries to get them through the Forest Service on the radio, and when he can't, he's worried enough to go back and check for himself. I'm not making an attempt to rewrite it because that would be inherently better, but my point in that little exercise was that The Shining itself impacts almost nothing, and the few things it does could have been done with other means. It brings nothing unique to the table in terms of plot, narrative impact, or just storytelling value. As the movie presents it, it is completely superfluous. And this entire section is basically the one time I'm really acknowledging the book because I know enough about the differences to know that it makes way more sense that the book is named after it because of how much more it matters. But that is just not the case here. And if this wasn't an adaptation of an existing work, it would make more sense to get rid of it. There's also a few other things that happen in the scene between Danny and Dick that feel mishandled in small ways, but they're here. So attention is brought to the fact that Dick calls Danny by his nickname of Doc, despite not having been told it. And that's fine, except we haven't heard either Wendy or Jack call Danny Doc before this. Not in Wendy's scene with Danny at the apartment, not in the car on the way there. So what we get is, Mr. Halloran, how did you know we called Danny this name that the audience is finding out about for the first time? This movie had multiple chances to set it up. So the audience could either catch it themselves and realize, oh, he shouldn't know that name, and then feel clever themselves. Or even if they miss it, they can feel like the film was clever for sneaking it by them until Wendy pointed it out. But no setup given. Similarly, room 237. Danny specifically asks about it.
What about room 237?
And Halloran shuts that down hard, telling him to stay out. Danny literally had a vision earlier in the film. Why would you not insert a shot of a hotel door with 237 on it during those visions? We get the blood evader, the twins, Danny himself screaming in the dark, but not the thing that Danny's going to ask about in specific. So obviously he's seen this before. Why haven't we? Hey, it's Vera from The Edit. One thing occurred to me that might theoretically cover for this. I suppose it is possible that because of their Shining connection, Danny actually pulls the number 237 from Halloran's own head. It's a thing that Halloran thinks but doesn't want to say out loud, but Danny gets anyway. While that is possible, the fact that it didn't occur to me that that was even an option up until now kind of shows that if that is the intent, it's not communicated worth a dang. There's no signifier in the framing, the dialogue, or anything else that that's where he got it. So if that was the intent, they didn't communicate that well either. So I'm keeping it in the list of complaints. Either it wasn't set up in the vision when it should have been, or they could have made it clearer that Danny's just pulling stuff out of Dick. I could have worded that better. Like, this is basic fundamental setup for things that, as the movie is currently standing, it just feels like they happen because the script says that's where that happens and for no other reason. All right, jumping to a month later, we get Wendy wheeling in a cart of food to Jack and Danny riding around on his big plastic tricycle. Now, the tracking shot that follows Danny is worth highlighting. It follows close behind and low to the ground, and the sound design is just exquisite. The thundering sound of tires on the wood being muffled almost completely by the intermittent rugs and carpeting. It's great. For a while. Problem is it goes on way too damn long, especially considering it travels mostly through areas we've seen before, so it's not even establishing geography like some of the earlier extended moving shots we're doing. This is the start of me noticing that shots were holding for way longer than they needed to in order to, make the point and move on. I'm going to circle back onto this because not only is it an issue in and of itself, but it's going to contribute to another problem. So just note that it starts happening here, or at least this is where I started feeling like that is going longer than it should. When Wendy brings up food to Jack, we get a really interesting scene where most of it is shot through the reflection in the mirror, and as a result, we only see Wendy's back. This is actually really fantastic. Wendy isn't being regarded by the camera at all, but even the image of Jack isn't actually him, it's just the reflection of him. This is good cinematic storytelling because it's a shift on standard shooting that isn't drastic enough to feel fundamentally wrong, but it is just different enough to feel a little bit off-putting. I do need to pause my praise there, though, because we get this line from Jack.
It was as though I'd been here before.
Okay, yeah, that's another one we're gonna have to circle back on. We see Jack failing to get any writing done while Danny and Wendy explore the hedge maze. There's some nice visual integration with Jack looking down on the model of the maze as the camera gives a bird's eye view of his wife and child in the real version of the same maze before the camera cuts down to their level. It's good. See? I told you I can be nice when it works. We get a title card for Tuesday, and this is where another issue starts to really raise its head and make its presence known. Initially, this whole thing is fine. Wendy's opening an industrial-sized can of fruit cocktail as the news gives the heads up about the incoming snowstorm. We get another tracking shot behind Danny where he stops at room 237, finds it locked. Jack is typing away at a steady pace, and it's that last one I need to put some focus on because it's part of a rather significant leap in Jack's behavior. The last time we saw him, he wasn't even sitting at the desk. He was tossing a ball around and wandering the hotel. Now, he's typing away like he's well into his work and he's on a roll. And does anyone else feel like we're missing a step in between? Does anybody feel like we're missing a scene where he, actually sits at the desk, hits a key, maybe for the first time, maybe even a little hesitantly? Or failing that, if you want to imply that the hotel / ghost / general evil of the place is the only thing actually motivating him, maybe you should imply that he's being contacted or controlled or hearing voices, but nothing like that has happened yet. And the thing is, that's not the only aspect of Jack that has taken a pretty drastic leap, because there's also his reaction to Wendy coming in to talk to him, as well as, just existing in his presence at all. Now, on the one hand, I actually get this scene more than I ever have before, at least up to a point, because As a creative who works from home and whose workflow can be both difficult to get into and also be interrupted at any moment, yeah, I get the frustration.
Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration.
But then there's his actual words and the level he takes it to. Just like his suddenly going from not touching the typewriter to banging out page after page, this really feels like we're missing a step here. I'm not going to say there was zero annoyance towards Wendy in their earlier interactions, but this is going from like a 2 to an 8 with no middle step. It gets weirder as a way of presenting this when you take into account we're going to get some clear signifiers of things escalating later on when the hotel, starts flatly messing with Jack. But again, none of that has happened yet. So what gives? This is what I meant when I said I do not agree that the film succeeds in blurring the lines between Jack's abuse and the machinations of the hotel. Because so far, there's absolutely no indication of the hotel doing anything to Jack directly. But if this is just who he is and he's gotten to this point all on his own, then those missing steps matter all the more because without them, it means we don't understand him well enough as a character for this to track as being just a him problem. Hey folks, it's me again. I'm jumping in to point out that Jack's behavior could be taken as a depiction of certain mental conditions or mood disorders. Now, there's zero indication in the film that that is an intended reading. And also, given the understanding of mental health at the time, it was probably not inserted there intentionally. Even if it was, that gets us into the issue of mental illness being depicted as someone being violent and dangerous, which is its own thing. But I bring it up because I don't want to leave an implication that somebody going from 2 to 8, as I described, as being something that isn't possible. It absolutely is, and people will have experiences of either having those mood swings in real life or being around someone who does. But again, circling back to the fact that we don't really get to know what Jack's normal is before he's in the hotel and potentially being influenced by it, we really don't know whether this is just him. The movie really needed to establish better what his normal is. And I at least think my frustration with this section kind of illustrates that. The man is acting as if something has affected him. But there's no indication that anything supernatural has actually started happening outside of Danny's visions, which are presumably of future events. So we don't know if we should even be taking any of that kind of stuff into account yet when it comes to Jack. And yet he's acting like this. It's just a freaking mess. Oh, okay, we need to back up again because there is a moment here that I like, but is also going to tee me up for a later issue. So let's talk about the music. Now, this might get tricky because I don't know how much of the music I can actually share with you properly, thanks to how squirrely YouTube gets about that kind of thing. A more complete version of this video is probably going to be up on the Patreon, but I'll try my best. So we get this slow build of music as we push in on Jack from behind, followed by showing his face as he types, followed by a static shot from behind as Wendy enters and tries to talk to him. And the whole time, the music is building in intensity until abruptly stopping with a sting when Jack pulls the paper out of the typewriter.
How's it going?
Fine.
This is good stuff. It's putting us on edge only to stop and make us think, oh, that was just a fake out, until we see Jack's turn in the intensity of his behavior, and then we realize we are actually justified in being on edge. The music's doing a lot of work here. But later on, in combination with shots that go on way too damn long, it's going to start feeling more like the music is doing all the heavy lifting and making up for pacing issues. But hold that thought for now, because I'm going to pull all this together a little bit later. When it gets worse. Next title card is Thursday. So, all right, we've skipped a day. Anyway, the snowfall has already happened. Danny and Wendy are outside, and Jack is pulling this face. This shot. This goddamn shot right here might be the keystone for my feelings on why Jack's descent into madness just doesn't work. Because he looks completely gone. This is a look of evil. There is no hint of humanity left in this man. Why is this shot here? I don't mean why is it in the movie at all. I mean, why is it at this point in the movie? In my memory, this shot came after Jack first sidled up to the ghost bar, because that's when it makes sense for it to happen, to show the impact of that. But It doesn't. Why the hell is there a shot where he looks completely lost to madness when we haven't yet had the scenes of him tipping over into that madness? And we're about to get a scene in a little bit where it seems like he might actually still be fighting it. There isn't like a lead in to this face where it seems like he's normal but then being taken over. He doesn't shake it off as if he is trying to beat something back. It's just this. Why would you put this shot at this point in the story? And I know it feels like I'm making a big deal out of this one tiny thing, but it seriously drives me up the wall. So next jumps to Saturday. And it was only at this point while writing the script for this that I looked at my notes and realized every single title with a day is actually 2 days after the previous one. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Monday, Wednesday. Oh, I bet the theory crafters are all over that one. But you know what? For my purposes, just watching the damn movie as is, there's a clear skipping over of things, and I can't help but wonder if, I don't know, maybe some of those things might have been important. Anyway, Saturday gives us Wendy's awkward attempt at a casual conversation with the folks at the Forest Service, and then Danny encountering the twins in the hallway. It's odd to me that the tracking shot leading to the twins' reveal is so much shorter than every other tricycle tracking shot in the movie. Though I'm sure a film bro somewhere has a reason why it's genius for some reason. Anyway, naturally, this is one of the most memed moments from the entire movie, and it's effective enough for what is honestly a pretty standard bit of ghostliness. Yeah, it's fine. Monday, we get a fittingly awkward conversation between Danny and Jack during a point when Jack has been lolling about in bed. The music, it's a touch overbearing, but otherwise, this is a pretty effective scene of Jack seemingly half out of it while talking to his son, and it ends with this low-key, unhinged line reading and this grin.
I'll never do anything to hurt you. Never. You know that, don't you?
Yes, Dad.
And I can't help but think that that grin would have hit a hell of a lot harder if we hadn't already seen his full-on psychotic look just a few scenes earlier. Yeah, I'm back on this. Just think about how much more unnerving this grin from Jack while talking to his son would have been if we'd not yet seen anything like that expression on his face already. You know, for a hot second, I even indulged in a little theory making at this point. You know what? Let's do this. Let's go down the road on a little mental cul-de-sac. Okay, so here's the little thought rabbit hole that I fell down. What if we're not actually skipping days, but we're just getting them out of order? Now, we're still going to have a gap because we don't have all the days a week accounted for in the title cards, but let's say that this starts with Saturday. Now, Saturday gives us Wendy's radio chat showing that she's reaching out for other interactions because her husband feels distant. And Danny spots the twins on that day, so we're starting to layer in the haunting elements earlier on. We do skip a Sunday if we go strictly by the title cards, but if we go into Monday, Danny goes for his fire truck when he thinks his dad is asleep, and we have that whole awkward conversation between him and Jack. Now, if we do it this way, Jack has been in bed all day. There's an implication he might have been there the entire day before as well, if not longer. Something's wearing Jack down, making him weak and off-kilter, and we see that in how he talks to Danny. Alternatively, we could also insert a Sunday because the first day to kick off this whole thing isn't actually named because it's just a month later. So that day of Jack bouncing around the ball and Wendy and Danny in the maze could have been Sunday. And if that's the case, that would mean Jack has stalled out on his writing attempts, and then as a result of that is why he spends Monday in a funk in bed all day, and then Monday plays out as we've already seen it. Tuesday comes, Jack finally has the spark. He's writing now. And this makes his snapping at Wendy make a little bit more sense and feel like a more natural progression because we saw how he was starting to crack and seem off with his interactions with Danny just the day before. Plus, we've extended the entire I can't get anything written funk so that now we've gotten multiple unproductive days from him, and we can see why he'd be annoyed at the interruption even if his anger is more than is warranted. But again, now it's building on what came before. So, Wednesday. Okay, I haven't gotten to Wednesday in the main thing before I started this whole tangent, but Wednesday's a big day. This is the day with ghost bartenders and murderous nightmares and women in bathtubs and Jack's thin veneer of niceness fully falling away and him getting clear instructions to correct his family straight from the spirits in the hotel. We go to Thursday, and now, we get the maniacal grin of murderous intent. Jack's descent flows so much better if we assume that the order of events is different from the order that is shown in the movie. But it's also nonsense, because this doesn't work at all because of temporally locked events like the snowstorm and the phone lines going down, and there's no clear indication that anything is out of order or there's any nonlinear storytelling going on. This is all just projection and cope to try and impose meaning on stuff that just doesn't make any f***ing sense! Ah! Okay, actually getting back to the damn film. Wednesday, we kick off with Danny playing with his cars in this Apollo 11 sweater that has been at the heart of some of the most unhinged conspiracies around this movie, so we are moving right the hell on from that. A ball rolls to him and he gets up, goes down the hall, finds one of the rooms open. Room 237, to be specific. Now, okay, the film does a pretty bad job of covering what the hell's up with this room. Why did Danny know about it? Why is it trying to draw him into there in particular? Why does he let it when he's been told to stay away from it by somebody who, seems to be clued in about this place? Why is he even playing in the hallway near that danged room other than narrative convenience? Like, if this was made today, I'd honestly accusing it of being deliberate theory fodder. But that kind of exhaustive overanalysis wasn't really a thing in 1980, at least not to the degree that you would design a film around it. Anyways, Danny enters the room. Wendy hears Jack screaming, rushes to him, and here we get basically the only time in the entire film where Jack seems genuinely troubled by what's going on around him and his own mind. This scene, his screaming and his distress at having dreamed he killed his family, is the only hint in the entire film we get that he's ever fighting the influences of the dark forces that are bombarding him, whether they're internal or external. And it comes after him seemingly marching right up to the line of having these very kinds of thoughts during his waking hours and being gleeful about it. I mean, what the hell else is that shot meant to convey? Where was the remorse and the fear before this? Why is it here now? It honestly feels like backfill more than anything else. If you're not familiar with that term, it's something that happens mostly in serialized storytelling, where a later episode or chapter or whatever gives us information or character aspects that should have appeared earlier, but the writer either didn't realize that they need this in there or thought they'd conveyed it better, so now they have to backfill it in. If this was a serialized piece released in episodes, I would assume that this is a last-minute attempt to combat accusations of Jack looking like he was already fully gone earlier than the creators meant it to look. And so now they're going, no, see, he's distressed, he's fighting it. We promise he hasn't already gone over the edge, see? Except this isn't serialized, it's a single piece of entertainment, so why the heck is there no hint of him giving any pushback prior to this? Anyway, Danny enters the scene moving slowly with a bruise on his neck and his sweater torn. Wendy comes to what is the most logical conclusion available to her in that moment.
You did this to him.
And she leaves the room with her son. Jack, already shaken by his nightmare, is about to break, having now been accused of something that, to the best of his memory, he did not do. And this works. Especially with his whole alcoholism issue, one of the most frustrating things for anyone trying to be better than they used to be is being treated like they're still the person they're trying to move on from. And in a dark and vulnerable moment, it's very easy to slip into the thought, what's the point of even trying to be good if people are going to treat me like I'm still a monster anyway? And that's where so many people who are trying to be better slip up and backslide. So in isolation, the shift from Jack's distress at the nightmare to his hostile frustration works. He probably needed comfort in that moment and instead faced accusations, and it hardened him in the worst way. That's not to blame Wendy, I'm just explaining his perspective. But of course, that's in isolation. Out of isolation, there's the issues of inconsistency, where the heck Jack's at mentally at any given point. But I'm trying to be fair because we're going into what I think is the single best scene in the entire movie. So Jack sidles up to the empty ballroom bar, expressing his desperate desire for a drink.
My goddamn soul. Just a glass of beer.
He covers his face, and when he uncovers it again, his demeanor changes.
Hi, Lloyd.
A cut back introduces Lloyd, the bartender. There's so much I love about this scene. First of all, Joe Turkel just gives a pitch-perfect performance. He's so good for this calm yet somehow off-putting figure of Lloyd the bartender, talking to Jack in this coldly courteous tone as Jack himself flips between the most boisterous and happy we've ever seen him to ranting frustration. This is also where we get the concrete confirmation that Danny's injury happened 3 years ago. Even Jack's only been sober for 5 months. I've actually run into people trying to claim that this discrepancy is somehow the hotel's doing, but it lines up with what Wendy herself said before to the doctor, and that happened well away from the hotel. So no, just no. I know I'm trying to avoid the fan theory aspect of this, but like seriously, every time I accidentally stumbled across something like that, it basically required flatly ignoring some aspects or moment or piece of dialogue in order to work. One more reason not to engage in it, but like I would still come across it while just trying to deal with this straightforwardly. Anyway, coming back to the scene, I really like that there's no music in this part. It just lets Nicholson go and show Jack crumble willingly as he downs the drink in one, starts to rant about his wife and kid. Lloyd barely has to do anything other than give the man one glass and let him go. So little active encouragement is needed for Jack to go off that it really peels back the resentment that he's been letting bubble away in his mind for probably the entire time he's been sober.
That bitch. As long as I live, she'll never let me forget what happened.
This whole thing is just great. And it still works even as Wendy arrives desperately looking for Jack and saying, Danny says there's a woman in room 237 who attacked him. What should be a moment of relief for Jack, because he's no longer being blamed for what happened to Danny, comes too late. He's already slid back to how he was before the start of the film, and it's all downhill from here for him.
Which room was it?
Good stuff. Solid gold even. No sarcasm for me on this scene. You know, aside from the fact that we're only now showing him fully given to the hotel when we only barely saw him fighting for it for the first time after looking like he'd already fully succumbed even before that. But yeah, in isolation, this scene, masterful. So, before we get to the infamous bathtub scene, we have to go to Dick Halloran's place in Florida where he's laying on a bed and we get this high-pitched sound as he pulls this face. This cuts back to Danny looking a fair bit freaked out. I'm pretty sure this is meant to convey that Danny is reaching out through The Shining for help. But the high-pitched noise keeps going as we cut to what is presumably Jack's POV as he enters room 237. So is that meant to tie into the idea of the hotel itself also having Shining? Or that maybe it wasn't even Danny directly reaching out to Dick, but rather both of them feeling the strain of what the hotel was doing to Jack? Or, oh, whatever, let's just get to the damn tub. Now, I'm not going to be able to show much of this scene because YouTube's going to YouTube, but this is where the whole issue I mentioned about shots and scenes lingering way too long, and how that's both a problem in and of itself, as well as how it strains the film's score. All that happens in the scene is he sees a woman naked in the tub. She gets out. He approaches her. They make out. She suddenly appears sickly and old. She laughs. He flees. Stretching that out to 4 minutes really does it no favors. And you hear the soundtrack desperately trying to keep the tension going throughout the entire thing because, can I be honest? Without the soundtrack, this scene really has very little going for it. Unless you have a visceral reaction to, ew, an old person naked. Yeah, they put some sickly marks on her and whatnot, but it's the sudden aging that's trying to be the harder hitting thing here, and I don't know what to tell you. I'm not inherently grossed out by a 52-year-old woman without dentures. And her laughing, which is basically all she does once Jack sees her sickly form, goes on for 40 seconds and it loses its impact after 20. And throughout all this, the soundtrack is breaking its back trying to carry the tension. Initially, it works in the build-up to Jack approaching her, but after a while, that languid pace just drags the whole thing down, even as the soundtrack tries to prop it up. Now, do you remember how I said the bartender scene worked great without the soundtrack? Let me be clear, that's not because the soundtrack is a problem. Wendy Carlos and Rachel Elkind do great work, but my point was that the bar scene was perfectly tense as is, so the soundtrack wasn't needed. In so much of the rest of the film, there's almost no tension without the soundtrack, and it has to work its ass off to try and inject some. A quick side note, by the way, Wendy Carlos was not only a pioneer in synthetic sound, but also a trans woman. She started her transition in 1968, had her gender-affirming surgeries in 72, and was publicly out as a woman by 79. So tell me again how trans people are a new phenomenon. I f***ing dare you. Anyway, to come back to my point, I really don't think that the bathtub scene works especially well unless you've got an inherent fear or strong aversion towards aging or old people, which, I mean, I guess it's why it almost worked on me when I was younger and saw this for the first time as a teenager, because that's when the idea of aging is probably at its most existentially terrifying if you actually let yourself dwell on it. But even then, it didn't leave that much of an impact on me, and it's lessened with every subsequent rewatch. And I don't think that that's just an issue of familiarity, because the bartender scene has never dimmed for me, may even have improved with more viewings. I just think the scene doesn't fully work. Actually, you know what? While we're on this kick, let me drill down on the whole shots lasting too long issue and how desperately the soundtrack tries to counteract it, because I don't want you to think that this is a one-off issue with the bathtub scene, because the bathtub scene might be the kickoff for this becoming a real problem, but there's so much of this. Like, you know this image, right? Probably the most iconic single frame from the film, besides maybe this one. Okay, so the moment when the axe fully breaks through is really good. But it's been going on for so long up to that point that by the time it happened, my thoughts aren't about fear or tension or anxiety. They're, wow, it's about time. Okay, look, maybe I'll grant that particular one does feel dragged out because I know the image it's building to, and that makes it seem longer, and maybe that's unfair as a critique with the film, like it's actually an inherent problem. But then there's this shot of Wendy finding Jack sabotage the snowcat. It just drags for freaking ever past the point of communicating everything there is to know about the scene, and the soundtrack is working overtime to try and not make it a slog. And again, the soundtrack work is good, but it shouldn't be the sole vehicle for keeping the tension going in a scene that would otherwise fall flat for how freaking long it drags. It's the same thing with the red rum scene, which starts out tense when Danny picks up the knife, but it just keeps going and going and going. And that poor kid had to say that line 43 times, and by the time Jack starts breaking down the door, it's a damned relief. Also, I know it's like a whole behind the scenes thing that the actor playing Danny had the fact that this was a horror movie hidden from him, and he just thought he was in a family drama until he saw it later on in life. But, all right, seriously? What was he told for the scene where he picks up a knife and croaks out red rum over 40 times? It doesn't really matter, but I don't know how you cover for that one and keep it from the kid. Anyway, fittingly enough, this goes on way longer than we needed to. That issue also extends to what gets kicked off after Jack flees room 237, which is Dick Halloran trying to contact the hotel and then deciding to go there himself. This is the kickoff to a process that will be depicted in excruciating detail. Between a failed phone call, 2 conversations with the Forest Service, a flight to Denver, a phone conversation to secure a snowcat, a drive in the snow to get to said snowcat, and the drive out on the snowcat to the hotel, and finally wandering around the hotel calling for anyone there, a chunk of which are shots or scenes that, again, go on way, way, way longer than they need to, or, don't need to be there at all. Like, if we get him on the phone saying he's going to drive to the guy who gives him the snowcat, do we need to see him take that drive? What the heck else was he going to do? But it's all drawn out and documented to an excessive degree. It keeps being cut back to feeling like the kind of needless coverage that was done so that there'd be maximum choice in the editing room, only for none of it to get trimmed. And all of this laborious documentation of every step of his trip from Florida to the hotel, just so he can be killed immediately. Even as a teenager, this one pissed me off the first time I saw it. All that work he did to get there, all that time you made me watch the entire process of him getting there, and he just dies? Like, instantly? Without even knowing if he helped or if Danny and Wendy were even still alive? Thereby turning the only prominent black character into fodder who exists just so Wendy and Danny can have a means to escape, and as soon as he's done that job, the movie kills him because he's got no point now? Seriously, this is one of my go-to examples of an overdeveloped character because ultimately the only thing meaningful that he does in the entire movie is bring a working snowcat. And you know what? In and of itself, that's fine. You don't always have time to flesh out every character or weave them into the story meaningfully. Some of them are just there to fill a narrative function, and that's it. It happens. But you don't do yourself any favors by sinking more time into them when no matter how much or how little you focus on them, they're still just there to accomplish a plot point, and that's it. Halloran could have been more if the shining stuff he lays out with Danny had, actually mattered at all, but as already discussed, it just doesn't. All right, where the heck are we in this thing? Oh, okay, right. After the whole bathtub scene, Jack comes back, tells Wendy there was nothing, which also feels a little bit unearned. Yeah, like, I could buy that Jack's the kind of guy who would just repress rather than confront something like this, but the film hasn't given us enough actual characterization for me to be sure that that's what's going on, or if it's just the hotel making him weird again. And I really do mean it when I say that Jack is undercharacterized. Basically, the only thing I know about him as a person is that he's losing it. I don't really get a clear picture of who the heck he was before he started cracking, which robs that descent of much impact as far as I'm concerned. It's part of why him cracking and when the heck it even is meant to have happened is so wonky. We have no clue what this guy's normal is, so how are we meant to gauge scenes like this where maybe he's passing for normal by his standards, but I don't know what those standards are, and I have nothing to measure it against. Anyway, Jack comes back, and we have a scene that almost works. Jack's calm, collected, and using that demeanor to undermine and manipulate Wendy, suggesting that Danny injured himself because the boy's own explanation is impossible. And when Wendy suggests taking Danny out of the hotel, Jack snaps. And when I say this almost works, there's an insert shot of Danny having a vision of red rum and then more of the blood evader. And thanks to that, we don't get to see the turn with Jack. We get the very start of Jack's anger before the insert shot, but when we come back, he's already in full rage mode. And I can't help but think back to the bartender scene and how chilling it was to watch a similar turn happen in real time rather than covering up the pivot point like this. Again, it feels like we just skipped over a middle step between clearly doesn't want them to leave and raging fury at the suggestion. But that middle step could have been covered just by getting to see Nicholson do the shift from one to the other. But nope, gotta give us a flash of the goddamn blood evader again. Jack storms out and gets lured by the sights and sounds of celebration back to the ballroom. And this time, it's full of partygoers as he approaches the bar. Some more banter with Lloyd, but the real purpose of this one comes when Jack is bumped into by a waiter who spills some drinks on him, and the two go to the bathroom to clean Jack off. In the bathroom, the waiter identifies himself as Delbert Grady, a previous caretaker who murdered his wife and twin daughters, something we learned way back during the info dump with Ullman towards the beginning. And this... I don't know what to do with this scene. All right, let's move past the repeated use of the N-word with the hard R to describe Halloran because I don't want to get into a conversation about whether or not it's appropriate for the word to be used in film in this way, even if it is being said by evil men or evil spirits or whatever. No. The reason that I don't know what to do with this scene is that it really confuses the hell out of me. Like, I get what it's doing in terms of pushing Jack further along the path of murder by, I mean, eventually euphemistically advocating for it outright.
But I corrected them, sir.
I get that. But what the hell is Grady's deal? What the hell is the whole "you've always been the caretaker" thing? And for that matter, what the hell is up with the final shot of the damned movie? Yeah, let's try and untangle this mess, because it's part of why I say that this movie may be trying to walk a line between interpretations, but to me, it just comes off as not being able to decide what the hell the deal actually is. Namely, what I want to know is this. Is this a story of a man who's been here before and is ultimately fated to be here again no matter what he does? Or is this a story of a vulnerable man whose inherent flaws make him prey to supernatural machinations? Because if this is fate, and he has in fact, quote unquote, always been the caretaker, then why did Grady ever have that role in reality? If it was fate, then why do we even need alcoholism and abuse in Jack's background? Wouldn't it be a greater fall if he was a decent guy, but he was always fated to become this no matter what? And if it's not actually fate, and he's just vulnerable to the hotel because of his inherent flaws, and he is an unwitting victim, then why are we getting all the
It was as though I'd been here before.
and
You've always been the caretaker.
I'm not even saying that there's no way to reconcile these things, but the film doesn't do it, which is why I bring up the final shot of the movie. What the hell is this meant to signify? Are we meant to take it that Jack was always in that picture and thus in some way has always been here and has always been fated to return? Or are we meant to assume that he didn't used to be in that picture before now, and now he's there because he's been so fully subsumed by the hotel as to be integrated into its history at the cost of his own? Either one could work, but I don't know which it is, or whether it's some third thing I'm not even thinking of. Because there's also this slow pan down to the date, which is done with such deliberateness that I assume it must mean something, but that specific date doesn't mean anything. Not within the movie in and of itself, not without a bunch of theory nonsense. Like, it's already clear that this is an old picture and there's no way Jack should be in it. We get that. That date doesn't establish that fact. We already get it. And why the 4th of July? What freaking meaning does that have beyond more theory bait that I refuse to engage in because I shouldn't have to come up with a doctoral thesis of meaning in order to understand a freaking movie? Even the first time I saw this, I thought, what the hell? Now, when I was a teenager, I assumed I must just have missed something. But there's just nothing there to get. As presented, it's just freaking nonsense. Okay. Wendy comes up with a plan to leave with Danny. We touch base on where Halloran is in his march towards death. We get, "Danny's not here, Mrs. Torrance." And that brings us to Wendy finding the manuscript. Now again, shots go on way too damn long. The number of times I found myself thinking, yeah, I get it, with how long she goes through those pages is more than I care to count. But when Jack confronts her, the scene does turn into one of the better ones in the film. This one has a chilling realness to it that is one of the things I've come to appreciate more as I've gotten older. Wendy is terrified of him, but that alone isn't what makes this so scary. It's that she's terrified while still trying to talk him out of doing what she's afraid of. That she's trying so desperately to negotiate through her fear and barely managing to get the words out, and Jack just menaces her at every step. While I'm fortunate enough to not have been witness to that kind of abuse in real life, I have seen things that are in the same general vein as this. And I've known enough people with more direct experience who've told me that this scene has an almost too real quality to it that is especially chilling. Jack's relentless stalking of her, undermining her, openly mocking her, how the ridiculing playfulness drops out of his voice when he tells her to
Stop swinging the bat.
It's really strong stuff, and this is a place where the music enhances the tension rather than having to make up for the tension losing steam. This strength continues as Wendy drags Jack to the pantry and he tries to trick, bully, and berate her into letting her out. It is a harrowing and only slightly exaggerated depiction of tactics that abusers use to keep their victims from leaving. A bit undermined by it leading to the interminable shot of Wendy finding the busted snow cab, but we did that when we talked about the overlong shot issues in general. So now we cut to Grady being on the other side of the door. Or, okay, rather we cut to Jack still in the pantry and we hear Grady outside. And this is where anybody claiming, it's possible none of the ghosts are even real. It's just in Jack's head. Those people need to pack it in. Because, yeah, it's true we don't see Grady, and I've seen people bring up the symbolic meaning of every scene in which Jack interacts with the ghost also has mirrors in it in some way, and how that's about they're just a reflection of him. But you can't tell me the ghosts aren't real when they open the damned locked door. If the ghosts aren't real, who opened that door? Plus, Danny was seeing stuff. Even Wendy's going to be seeing stuff by the end, so it can't all be in Jack's head anyway. But this scene is played like it's making the point that Jack is now fully gone and is 100% on board with the murder plan.
I fear you will have to deal with this matter in the harshest possible way, Mr. Torrance. I fear that is the only thing to do.
There's nothing I look forward to with greater pleasure.
You give your word on that, do you, Mr. Torrance?
I give you my word.
Except, he seemed like he was pretty on board with the idea ever since the first scene with Lloyd. Like, he didn't leap directly to murder right after that, but there wasn't really any sign of hesitation. And this feels like a pretty natural progression from where he was, and he hasn't been fighting it since that point. But the film tries to play this off like it's a big moment. This is also part of why the red rum reveal doesn't work for me, even aside from the length of the shots. Like, the scene drags on too long. I already talked about that. But more fundamentally, this is useless information to both the audience and the characters. Was there any doubt from viewers that Jack was going to try and murder them by this point? And as for Wendy seeing it in the mirror for what it really is, this ultimately leads into Jack trying to break into the apartment with an axe, and I think she'd have gotten the threat from that alone, so her seeing murder written on the door doesn't mean or accomplish anything besides one more way in which Danny's shining eats up time while not impacting the damn story. All right, we're in the home stretch. Here we go. Danny escapes out the window, only to run back into the hotel, hide in a cupboard. We get, here's Johnny. Halloran shows up, promptly dies. Danny gives away his hiding spot for some reason. Jack chases him into the hedge maze. Wendy sees some ghosts, including this moment, which feels both like a what the hell, while also being a moment of overbanking on one element being off-putting, kind of like with the bathtub scene, because in that one it was, ew, an old, and here it's, ew, a furry. But unless you're actually inherently grossed out, it's not scary, it's just weird. She sees the blood evader, but by now we've seen the thing so many times it really has no meaning. Danny does an actually quite clever thing with his walking backward into his own footprints to confuse his father in the hedge maze before escaping with his mother. Jack appears to degrade both physically and mentally until we get what might be the single funniest hard cut in cinema history. I'm not kidding either. I laugh my ass off at that every time. It's hilarious. But then we get that infuriating push in and the whole old-timey photo, but I've already gone off on that. That's 143 minutes of my life burned away into the ether for the, 6th or 7th time, maybe 8th. Because for this video, I actually watched the damn thing twice because I kept pausing it to take notes the first time, and then I needed to watch it again without pausing in order to confirm my suspicions about its garbage pacing and overlong scenes without that being unduly influenced by my doing a bunch of stop and starts. I have watched this more than movies I've actually liked. I've watched this more than Nimona. That alone is a damned crime. But it's okay. Okay. That's my grumpy old person yells at cloud take on a movie that I can't stand but everyone else seems to love. And in a superficial shot at fairness, I asked Twitter to give me the things they liked about the movie with the caveat that I didn't want to hear about filming techniques, Kubrick's perfectionism, or theory crafting. So, basically the same guidelines I put out at the start of this video. And I got a decent number of replies. You know what? I'm not even going to argue with them. Instead, I'm going to use those as a springboard into a way to end this extremely negative video in a positive way. From what I saw on Twitter, there were a few recurring praises for the film which came up repeatedly. The atmosphere and the sense of isolation, the ambiguity of the haunting elements, the realness of the depiction of abuse, a certain dreamlike quality, or I guess nightmare quality would be more fitting, a focus on a small cast and getting to see someone crack and break on the screen, and a whole lot of praise for the synthetic score. Now, I don't agree with all those praises, but like I said, I'm not going to argue. Instead, I'm going to offer up a movie that I think does every single one of those points better. Better atmosphere, ambiguity that enhances rather than confuses the intent, a small group of people isolated in a large building as some of them start to crack and lash out, dreamlike qualities, an amazing synthetic score. Heck, it even has a writer who drinks too much and tips over into moments of slightly too real feeling abuse of the woman in his life. My friends, I give you Gothic. A 1986 film directed by Ken Russell with a core cast of only 5 people as it presents a fictionalized horror take on the fabled night between artists that's believed to have inspired one of those artists, Mary Shelley, to write her seminal work, Frankenstein. It's soaked in atmosphere and knows precisely what it is. It's a mood piece. It's not here to tell you a story that goes from A to B to C. It's 88 minutes long. It feels so much longer, not because those 88 minutes are a drag, but because by the time you're done, you felt like you took in so much. There is no way that that could all have fit into a runtime that short. I have a full review up in the break room if you want to hear more of my thoughts. But seriously, if any of the things that I listed are the reasons you like The Shining, I cannot recommend Gothic enough, because this is exactly what I would have hoped for out of this kind of story about madness, isolation, abuse, and frustrated artistic ambitions. And if The Shining can't give it to me, that's okay, because I've got Gothic. There we go. It feels good to end on a positive note. And I hope you've stuck through the whole thing to actually get there. If you did, my thanks to you. And also, if you made it this far, I especially want to hear what you think about all this. Keeping in mind that my goal here was not to convince you to think The Shining is bad, but to help you understand the reasons why I think it is. If you can keep things polite, even as many of you are likely to disagree with me, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Like, share, subscribe, that all helps. Links to other things I do in the description, you know the deal. But what I really would like you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council, I'm just running the meetings, and until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to give thanks to my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfula, Goddess Elida, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Oliver B., Melissa Pedersen, Movie Turtle, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Melinda Walters, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fernabi Likes the Poodle, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, Quite Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, Pau Baraba Jago, Mira G, and Sir Didymus is my favorite. I don't know, it feels right that it's October the first time you're seeing all 3 of these at the same time.